Dr. Craig, Bart Ehrman has been doing a lot of heavy thinking lately, and a lot of people have sent me this article saying, wow, check this out. And it got a lot of people's attention because the title of the article is A Revelatory Moment About God from Bart Ehrman, who is who was a great and well-known textual critic who deconverted from Christianity. You've had an opportunity to debate him. Basically, he spells out his agnosticism, and he says he has a meditation practice, and he's been meditating on consciousness a lot. But then some things occurred to him, Bill, and I think we can sum it up this way. What occurs to him is that a rock has no way of recognizing that an animate object such as the dandelion exists. And then a dandelion has no way of recognizing that a panther exists. Now it gets a bit tricky, he says. A panther has no way of recognizing that a superior intelligence exists. Yes, a panther does recognize in some instinctual sense that there are things out there to look out for, but the panther has no way of realizing that there are people who can engineer skyscrapers or split atoms or reconstruct the history of Rome. It is simply not in its purview. And so he's got this hierarchy here.
Yes.
And then he says, humans can and do recognize, analyze, study, think about, reflect on these other forms of life. But he's just saying that we all think, we as people think that we are the pinnacle of life and that there's nothing above us. And if a slug or a dandelion or something had thinking abilities, it would think the same thing. And so he says, how can I know whether there is a superior intelligence or a superior being above me? He said, in the same way the panther may not know that, or the rock or the dandelion may not know that, how could I know that that is? And so he just seems to have reaffirmed in agnosticism.
I think that's right. All Ehrman has done here is to present an argument that deepens his agnosticism about God by claiming that it's impossible to know whether there is some order of being higher than you are. I think many people have misunderstood this blog. From what I have seen, folks think that Ehrman is saying that human beings have awareness, intentionality, self-consciousness, and so forth, and that these cannot be adequately explained on a purely materialistic basis. And therefore, there must be minds, and there could be an order of mind or intelligence higher than us. And that's not his argument at all, unfortunately. I wish it were. I have defended in my work an argument for God's existence based on intentionality. This figures in my debate with Alex Rosenberg, for example, where I argued that intentional states of consciousness would not in all probability exist on a purely naturalistic worldview, because all you have is just matter in various complex configurations, and mind and intentionality are not capable of being a property of a purely material object. So I think that would be a great argument for saying that there could be higher states of being than we are. But that's not his argument, as you quite rightly point out. He just wants to say is that in the same way that these lower levels of being cannot know that there's something above them or not, so we cannot know whether there's something above us or not.
And so he says, and so really, toward the bottom of page 2, agnosticism is the only option, not in the sense of a shoulder shrug, hey, what do I know, but in the sense of a deep, thoughtful response. I have precisely no way to adjudicate the view one way or the other.
Yes. It's the only option. We have to be agnostics on Ehrman's view. So I think you can see he's just cemented himself into his traditional position. Now, what argument does he give here for this? The argument is that when you look at lower forms of life that do not have self-consciousness, rationality, and freedom of the will, in other words, that are not persons, they cannot conceptualize higher forms of life. But that provides no justification whatsoever for his claim that we cannot conceptualize higher forms of being and think about them and ask whether or not they exist. Clearly we can, and we do. So Ehrman's argument is flatly refuted by philosophical reflection and experience, which does deal with these sorts of questions. We did a podcast some time back about what is the faculty or organ that God has given to human beings for discerning his existence. And the blogger quite rightly pointed out it's reason. Reason is the faculty that God has given us for discerning his existence. And Ehrman just doesn't seem to grasp the point. He thinks that we're still, in a sense, stuck on the same level as these lower level, non-rational, non-self-conscious beings, and there's no good reason to think that.
He wraps it all up by saying, I'm obviously not urging a return to traditional religion. This insight decidedly does not justify anyone in saying, see, I was right, my view of God is plausible, your view of God might be completely implausible, and based simply on what you heard from people living 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, who were generally far more ignorant of the world than we are, and are simply doing their best to figure it out. So my insight does not argue that there must be a single Jewish or Muslim or Christian God, or archangels or demons or whatever. For me, those are just mythological constructs that are trying to make sense of it all.
So that's fine if he wants to believe that, but he doesn't have a good argument, I think, for his claim that agnosticism is the only option, that we have no means of discerning whether or not there are higher levels of reality. I notice in the previous paragraph, he gives the example of these lower life forms, and he says they can't imagine something higher than them. So what makes us think we would have the capacity to imagine whatever it is that is above us in the pecking order? And the answer is reason. Reason is what gives us the ability to imagine higher orders of reality and to try to understand them. So this is not, as he says, pure arrogance or hubris. It means that we as human beings are gifted with a faculty that these lower forms of life are not.
In the last two sentences, he wraps it up by saying, if superior forms of intelligence and will do exist, I would literally have no way of knowing. And how many different forms or levels could there be? God knows, so to speak. Well, Bill, I guess there'd be two approaches, because he just says there's no way to know. Your argument from intentionality, argument from consciousness, the argument from reason that you mentioned would address specifically that epistemological concern that he has. But what about revelation? What if this being chose to reveal himself to us?
Well,
now he discounts
that's a
that.
Very good point, Kevin.
Well,
we're thinking here that we have been abandoned to our own devices to figure out what higher orders of being exist. But of course, the biblical view is that God has graciously condescended to reveal himself to us through Jesus Christ and other means, and by miraculous acts like raising him from the dead as a vindication of his truth. So you're quite right in drawing our attention not only to these natural means of knowing God exists, like reason and arguments for God's existence, but divine revelation as well.